Emily Martyn, on the topic of how to get the best translations. And I want to remind you that after the talk, we will have the questions again, and please use Slido for this. So enter slido.com and then enter the hashtag Babel. Babel is the keyword. And now there is Emily.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Emily, and I am the Languages Manager at language learning company uTalk. Today, I'm going to be talking with you about tried and tested techniques to get the best translations. So before we start, just to give you some background, I studied translation at university. So my undergrad was French and Spanish, and I got the chance whilst I was there to volunteer as a translator for a charity called Banana Link. And from this experience, I got into working in the translation industry, not actually as a translator myself, even though that was a big part of what I studied. Actually, I started out my career as a project manager for a translation agency. So there I was mostly working on overseeing translation for an FMCG company, a fast-moving and consumer goods company. And that was mostly marketing content. A lot of it was for mainstream European languages. I spent a lot of time checking French and Spanish translations and working with freelancers who translated into those languages, but also some other languages like Greek and German. You would be amazed at how many errors a second pair of eyes can pick up looking over a translation, even if that second pair of eyes actually doesn't really recognize a lot of the words. More on that later. But by this time, I knew full well that practicing translation is a great discipline for honing second language skills. So when I moved to Spain to teach English as a foreign language, I made sure that my students got plenty of translation practice in. So fast forward a few years, and as I mentioned earlier, I now work as the languages manager at language learning company uTalk. We have an app for learning over 150 languages, so I think you'd all agree that's quite a lot of languages. My day-to-day work involves managing the localization of the uTalk app that you can see here, as well as our website, utalk.com. It's currently been localized for 27 different territories, including Mongolia. So as you can imagine, I pretty much live and breathe translation. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to chat with you this afternoon about some experiences working in the translation industry, and hopefully save you guys from some of the pitfalls that I learned the hard way. Okay, so first of all, has anyone ever seen any terrible translations? There sure are plenty out there. Here are a few silly examples. So we have stuff only. The grass is smiling at you, please detour. Thank you for not smoking. No hay lugar, that's been translated as there is no place, and some other silly ones there. So I want you guys to have a think about some terrible translations that you might have seen over the years, and you can share them at the end if we've got time. So I know what you're thinking. How is it possible to produce such awful translations? Well, actually, there's a whole range of different reasons why. So in these examples, we can see that there are some misunderstandings of the meaning of the source text and nuances as well. We even have some typos or kind of spelling or grammatical errors due to the fact that presumably a native speaker did not do the translations, or at least a native speaker perhaps did not check the translations. Or do you know what? Maybe there were no checks at all. That could have been because they wanted to cut costs and save time. Maybe no human translator was involved at all. Maybe some kind of machine translation was used. And these examples are pretty funny, but what about mistranslations when it comes to signs that are aimed to keep people out of danger, or medicine packets, for example, explaining about the side effects of medicine? Mistranslations are a lot less funny when people's lives are at stake. So yeah, at this point, I'd just like to make the point that the act of translating is an important one, and I don't believe that machines will ever replace human translators. At least I hope not. Okay, so we can talk a bit more about that later, but yeah, do you think about your own terrible translations, and you can share them amongst yourselves later on, if we have time. Okay, so why is it so easy for translations to go so wrong? Well, the beauty of languages is that no two languages work in quite the same way, and it certainly is a challenge to render the same meaning and feeling behind the source text in another language. Indeed, I would say that it's impossible to retain exactly the same meaning at all times, and this is something that I have a hard time explaining to my monolingual friends. Translating is tough, and it is a skill, not just to translate, but to translate well. And I hope to demonstrate to you all today that there are some specific techniques that you can bear in mind whilst going through the translation process that can make a big difference to the final outcome, whatever you're translating for, whether it be a sign at a venue like the Polyglot gathering, a leaflet for a multi-million-dollar FMCG company, an email for a friend, or indeed e-learning content for a lang tech company such as uTalk. All right, so technique number one, we're going to kick off with what I would say is the easiest and most basic technique to get the best quality translations, and that is simply to check your translation. Please, first and foremost, run a spell check. This massively reduces the risk of double spaces or typos slipping through undetected, as well as any tags or programming language, particularly if you're working on an export of the source text in a computer-aided translation tool or CAT tool, such as Trados, for example. Scan your translation when you're checking it for key metadata, such as proper nouns or brand names, and make sure that those have been written correctly. Check that punctuation and capital letters have been used properly, unless, of course, you're translating into a language like Thai, for example, where different grammar rules apply. Please also make sure that you haven't accidentally forgotten to translate a part of the source text. This may sound silly, but when it's a long text that you've been working on for many, many hours, perhaps the format that it's in is not very user-friendly, it can happen. I've lost count of the number of translations that I've checked where the translator has missed out the odd sentence or two. And doing a back translation can help with this. And yeah, you can pick up on this even if you don't speak a word of the target language. Okay, so next, make sure that you've been consistent with any key terms that you might have used. For example, if you're using an acronym, it's customary to write the acronym or what it stands for out in full the first time, along with the letters, and then every reference that follows afterwards, you can just use the letters. So for example, fast-moving and consumer goods becomes FMCG. We're only humans, right? And humans do miss things and make mistakes from time to time. So if it's within your budget or you have enough time, I really, really recommend getting someone else to check over the translation. This could simply be a spot check or a full proofreading of the text. One quick word of warning on this. Sometimes it's not helpful to involve too many people in the checking process. This is because translation is delicate work, and many times there are multiple ways to translate the same text, all of which could be valid. So when it comes to proofreading, usually it's best if the checker only changes things that are actually incorrect, rather than making any preferential or stylistic changes. At uTalk, we always test our translators before we commit to working with them, and we only use native speakers. However, as a general rule, it is fine to use non-native speakers, as long as their level is equivalent of a native speaker. And you can thoroughly verify this. You can give them tests before you send any work to them. At uTalk, mostly because we're a British company, but also because English is generally the most commonly understood language, our translators always translate from English. However, sometimes we provide previously signed off translations that other translators can use to cross-reference. So one example of that is that we recently translated our e-learning content into kheri. This is an endangered language spoken on the Channel Island of Jersey, and it's related to Norman French. So our translators use the French translation of our e-learning content, which we'd already got done a while ago, to help guide them from time to time. I think it's also interesting for me to mention here that we employ a special technique at uTalk. This is for when we translate our e-learning content. So we actually use 2 different translators to translate the entirety of this text completely independently of one another. Why do we do this? Well, we found that this special technique is more costly, and it also tends to take longer to get the finished result. But for the purposes of this text, we have found that this is the best way for us to get the highest quality final result. Once they've both finished their translations, any words or phrases where they've chosen different translations get flagged. They then go through these and select their preference. Usually after this process, there are still a handful of words and expressions that the translators do not agree on. So the next stage is to get another native speaker involved to discuss the various options, subtle differences and nuance between the translations, and which final translation fits our style the best. Sometimes we have quite a lengthy debate on this, and it's a fun, rigorous linguistic process. I'm going to talk a bit more on this later on, but for now, moving on to our next technique. Moving on to our next technique, how to translate the untranslatable. I would say that this technique is particularly pertinent when it comes to minority and endangered languages, because oftentimes there is no agreed standard form. Sometimes, but not always. The size of the area over which the language is spoken, for example, can account for the vast differences in vocabulary employed and spelling. For example, a while back, we introduced an app for learning an endangered language called Ladino, also known as Judeo-Spanish, which is a diaspora spoken by people excuse me, whose ancestors were Sephardic Jews, now located in Israel, Turkey, Greece, the USA, the Balkans, and North Africa. One of our translators grew up in Turkey, whereas our other translator grew up in the US, although he had Israeli heritage, and they couldn't agree on how to translate the word for jellyfish. In the end, we settled on elacho de mar, which was the preference of our translator who grew up in Izmir. She grew up by the ocean, and she said she used this word all the time growing up, whereas our American translator, who lived in New York, had rarely, if ever, had a need to translate the word jellyfish. Although also being a Spanish speaker, his preference was actually the term medusa. So I think it's clear from that example that exactly where the linguist is from can have an impact on the translation because of the specific set of surroundings there. In this example, we have the contrast of a speaker surrounded by and therefore more heavily influenced by the coast versus someone who's more used to city life. It's also worth noting that at uTalk, we value each and every language, and as far as possible, we try to represent and honor all languages, and that includes different dialects as well. So, for example, we produced a course for learning Southern Sami, and we're not going to stop there. We're also hoping to produce courses for other types of Sami, including Northern Sami and Eastern Sami, such as Kilden Sami. As I'm sure you will all appreciate, this takes time, and there can be so many variants, so it's not always possible to represent all of them, but we are trying and giving it our best shot. We not long ago recorded the Cornish language. Cornish is an endangered indigenous language in Cornwall, which is in the southwest of the UK. It's a language that's closely related to Breton, which is spoken in Brittany in northwest France. And there are multiple variants of Cornish, including Modern Cornish, Late Cornish, and Middle Cornish. And they all have differences in spelling. For example, sometimes in Middle Cornish, the letter Y is used, whereas in Late Cornish, the letter E is used instead. For this reason, the Cornish Language Board introduced a standard written form of the language, which was widely accepted in 2009. And after some consideration and consultation with various linguists, this was the orthography that we settled on for our Cornish language app. However, for some languages where there is no standard form, I would recommend that whichever spelling you opt for to be consistent. This is the most important thing. Please don't ever spell the same word in multiple different ways within the same document. When it comes to our mainstream languages, we have tried our best to represent the most standard form of the language. So, for example, in our Basque app, we use translators from Navarra. So when you're selecting your translator, be clear on what the different language variants are, who your audience for the target text is, and therefore who will be the best fit. So when taking dialect due to different locations into account, it's also important to exercise cultural sensitivity. Please don't make the equivalent mistake that I made when I went to Burger King in Dubai and asked for a bacon cheeseburger. We have excluded any reference to pork-related products across all of our apps for learning Arabic, and we have 5 different Arabic variants on our app, due to the fact that most people in the countries where these dialects are spoken are Muslims. So in contrast to excluding vocabulary, sometimes it's necessary to invent entirely new words. I recently went to Hawaii to record Hawaiian, and one example of a new word that had to be created was the word for kettle. After much debate, our speakers settled on ipuhau kupavai, which literally translates as cup to boil water in. This is nothing new. As new inventions come about, new words have to be formed. However, if there is an institute or body which works to protect and preserve the language in question, it's always important to consult them first. And if the correct procedures are followed, in an ideal world, this word would then enter the dictionary and thus common usage. Again, by contrast, sometimes there are in fact too many words to choose from. For example, there are multiple words for snow in Russian. In Tagalog, there are different words for rice. In Arabic, there are several different words for camel. The word for horse in Mongolian depends on the age and function of the horse. And in Sanskrit, there are no less than 50 words to mean water. At uTalk, we have images which accompany each and every word and phrase in our e-learning content, and this guides our translators to the correct equivalent. However, debatably, it's not always an easy task, and that's why it's always important to have an open discussion with whoever is overseeing the translation work and have a good overview of the final destination and audience for where the target text is going to end up. A huge problem that some indigenous and minority languages face is that the next generation of speakers complain and object to using the language of their ancestors because they feel that there are not enough words in their language. For example, in Quechua, you'll often hear Spanish words dotted within sentences, particularly modern words, and sometimes you'll even find a Spanish word within a Quechua word. Sadly, this has contributed to the decline of younger people learning Quechua, as they argue that Spanish serves them better. So even though those who do speak Quechua to a high level will often code switch. I'm sure we're all too aware when it comes to new words entering old languages. However, I strongly believe in arguing the case that no language is irrelevant, and that although, yes, it is a big effort to stand up to, for want of a better word, dominant languages and cultures, steps can be taken to prove that languages can be revitalized and modernized and flourish, even in the face of preconceived sentiments that they're out of date. So let me give you some examples to prove that. Another example is the ancient language of Sanskrit. Yes, there are people, even now in the 21st century, who communicate in Sanskrit on a daily basis. Yes, the language can and has been adapted to the modern world, contrary to popular belief, and absolutely it can be used in contemporary contexts. It's definitely not just a language consigned to religious ceremonies. I know this because we worked with several of them based in the UK to produce a uTalk course in Sanskrit. And it's also spoken in Martyn, which is a village in northern India, where it's the primary language of the local people. So adapting a language to meet the needs of everyday 21st century language sometimes does involve inventing new words. For example, by using descriptive language, sometimes borrowing words, even if it's just a partial bit of the word and then adapted from other languages. So one other interesting example that I have on this is the word in Papiamentu, which is a language spoken in the Caribbean, in Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. And this is the language that they have for the word wetsuit. So it's very warm in the Caribbean, and they don't really need to use wetsuits ever. But we still wanted to translate this word so that, for example, people who speak Papiamentu as their first language, if they're traveling somewhere else, they might need to hire a wetsuit. So what translations did we consider? Well, we considered traje de agua, which literally translates as something like outfit of water. This was an expression that our translators made up. And I think that fits quite well. We also considered going simply with wetsuit, borrowing the word from English. But we finally settled on panja de duik, which is partly borrowed from the Dutch word for dive. Although, funnily enough, in our app, the Dutch that we went for wetsuit is actually simply wetsuit. All right, moving on to our next technique, considering issues specific to aspects of individual languages, or as I've simply named the slide, getting technical. I don't want to dwell on grammar right now, but there are some foundations that certain languages are built on which are unavoidable, such as gender agreements. In our app, we want to represent both male and female as far as possible. So the solution that we came up with was to write the male version with the female version following in brackets. Then, when the app is being used, each translated word and phrase is voiced by a male and a female native speaker. So, of course, the man says the male version, the female says the female version. For example, in French, we have je suis végétarien and je suis végétarienne. Why might this pose an issue? Well, for those of you who have used our app, we have a topic for adjectives, and for languages that have gender, this poses a challenge. For example, let me give you an example. So one example that we have for French is quiet, and we chose to translate this as silencieux rather than silencieuse because the image is of a speaker. And in French, this noun is masculine, it's un haut-parleur. So that's how we managed our work around that one without providing an explanation of grammar, as that is not our aim. But always bear the aim of the product that you're translating for in mind, because in other instances, it might be appropriate to provide both. I appreciate then that not everyone would agree with this approach. There could be other ways to tackle this challenge, but at the end of the day, we have to make a translation decision. Sometimes it could be the same difference and both could be valid. I would love to chat with anyone about this later on. This is one of the challenges, but also one of the beauties of translation. So did you know that not only adjectives change their form depending on the gender of the noun, but in some languages, the verb form itself can also change depending on whether a man or a woman is speaking. This is the case for Hindi, and we've also dealt with that using the same bracket technique that I just described. Not only that, but in Hindi, as well as other languages in India and beyond, the subject and thus the verb form can change depending on the age of the person speaking, or actually the age of the person who's being spoken to. So Hindi has 3 different words to mean you. We have app, which is the most respectful, followed by tum, with tu being the least formal. Sometimes it really is all about perspective. The age and gender perspective impacts other languages in different ways. For example, in Hawaiian, they don't simply have words for brother and sister, they also make the distinction between which sibling is elder. For example, kaikuahine refers to the sister of a male, whereas the sister of a female is kaikamahine, but kaikuana can mean the older brother of a boy or the older sister of a girl. In our app, we have done our best to represent this with our images, but it goes without saying that this is very challenging to represent in other languages where this concept simply doesn't exist. So this goes in some way to show why the free translation approach is necessary sometimes, but we will look into this and stylistic aspects to consider under our next technique in a moment. Just looking at the time, I think I'm going to skip a bit so we don't run over. So yeah, I just want to make the argument that context is key. And I believe that these sorts of issues justify the free translation approach, even if it means losing a bit of the meaning from the original source text to avoid the target text obviously sounding like a translation. We want it to sound like it was written in that language. However, at the same time, it is important to stay faithful to the source text. And yeah, by that, I mean that a translation it should be accurate to be considered a good translation, I think. So more on that under the umbrella of our next technique, which is to follow a specification and a style guide. Okay, so the uTalk specification and style guide amounts to 20 A4 pages. So that goes in some way to show how strongly we feel about guidelines and instructions. We believe that these are especially important for us because our app is translated into so many different languages. We have 150 so far. And we need to make sure that the same techniques and styles have been rolled out across the board as far as possible for it to work. Clearly, I don't have time to go through everything we've included in there, and actually we've covered some of our approach already, such as how we deal with certain important grammatical features, like gender. But just to try and give you an overview, a good specification or style guide will always specify exactly what the text type is. For example, if it's a website, an app, a book, or a leaflet, as well as the text's intended target audience. uTalk is an app focused on authentic, everyday, colloquial sort of language. However, this would not be appropriate for all apps, let alone all text types. The specification should therefore lay out the context, or where your translation is destined to end up. I find it really helps to look at the source text in its original format. So if it's a website, make sure you take a good look at the real live website before you tackle localizing it into your language. In our case, we provide screenshots of our app for our translators tackling our in-app UI. Without these, it may prove tricky to translate OK or select, for example. And these are prominent buttons which we can't afford to be ambiguous or confusing for our translators. To this end, it can be useful for the languages manager or project manager, if applicable, to provide the translator with a glossary or a translation memory so they can make sure that the terms they use are consistent with previous translations. As always, read the source text through once before you start the translation and ask the project manager any questions if there's anything that is not clear to you in the specification. It sounds really, really obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. So if there isn't a project manager, you could always ask a friend for a second opinion. It's usually easier to establish anything you're unsure about before doing the translation, rather than making errors and having to go back and make corrections retrospectively. Great, and yeah, images are really handy for providing context and clarification, and they can often clear up any questions that translators might have. Great. We've already established that the same word in the source language sometimes can be translated in multiple different ways in the target language. So a word of warning, don't always 100% rely on the translation memory or glossary. Another reason why it's very important to check the context and the images. Okay, not only that, but sometimes there is limited space, and you have to consider the aesthetics of the final result. So you might need to find a shorter translation to make it fit, cut down on the number of characters. You also might want clarification on whether a free or a more literal approach would be best. Our website, uTalk.com, is a great example of where a more free approach has been adopted. If you go and check it out, you'll see that the style is light and fun with catchy turns of phrase, taglines, and wordplay, not all of which have the same impact in each language. To give you an example, practice makes perfect. We have this on our app, and in French we've translated it as c'est en forgeron qu'on devient forgeron. So not a literal translation there, but a good reflection of the colloquial text. What's more, each of our language pages has a list of fun facts relating to each language, and we've tried to adapt these to be of interest to the local audience. So in some cases, we've used an entirely different fun fact. We actually haven't translated it at all. Great. So yeah, sometimes you're very much allowed to have the approach of taking some artistic license. All right, so don't forget that different text types do take different amounts of time to translate. The average translator can translate about 2,000 words per day. Cat tools help to streamline your work, so I would recommend using a cat tool such as Trados or MemoQ if you can. Okay, so our final technique before we open the floor to questions is the uTalk technique. So I've already mentioned that we use two independent translators. This is actually a technique that I'd never come across before starting to work at this company, but we found that it actually works really well for our specific type of translation. So I really recommend being open-minded in your approach. Even if you've been translating for a long time, there could be new and innovative things you could try to get the best quality translations possible that you've not come across before. We've also already considered our checking process, whereby each of the two independent translators check each other's work, and then they talk about any outstanding discrepancies. And what I didn't mention earlier is that a big reason why we get people to talk these things over is because this helps our translators to speak out their translations. And our translations are mostly destined to be voiced. So what you write isn't always necessarily what you would say. So this process of speaking out the translations can really help us to come to a final decision. Sometimes it also helps to have an outsider's perspective, someone who is not so closely and perhaps emotionally involved in the project. They can be a great person to act as a mediator, and someone who is familiar with the usual pitfalls of the text that many translators might struggle with across various different languages, as we always translate the same content into different languages. And that's a big part of what I do in my day-to-day. Okay, I've got another example of how we've tackled some tricky expressions where images have come in very handy. So one of these is skiing. So in many of the countries where we've represented their languages, skiing is not a commonly practiced sport, for example, in warmer climates. So some of our translators are not always completely au fait with all of the English technical terms that we have, but they might still be familiar with the actual concepts themselves. So that's one of the reasons, again, why images come in so handy. The uTalk tone of voice is colloquial, everyday language. I've mentioned that already. We've done our best to roll that out across all of our languages. And this is also why we've got all of our translators to translate the exact same content. So that it works across all of the different languages that we have. So you can actually learn any language, any of the 150 languages that we have from almost any of these 150 languages. So that means that we have over 20,000 language combinations, which I think you'll all agree is quite special. So there's no need to use English at all. Okay, so in conclusion, translation is tough, but it's worth going the extra mile to get great translations and to facilitate excellent communication. So we'll move on to questions in just a second. I also wanted to mention that we have a special offer for everyone here at the Polyglot gathering. We would love you to check out our app completely for free. You can check it out, and it's free for a whole year for you. And I would love to talk about it with any of you afterwards. So yeah, come and find me. So we'll open up to questions now. I'll just get the Slido up. Here we go. Wow, we've got lots of questions already. Great. Yeah, I can see. Yeah. Okay, we have a couple of questions from Miguel. Miguel, nice to see you. I think you're just online. I can't see you. Wave at me if you're here. No, you must be online. Okay, great to have you with us. So Miguel says, what are some good community-based dictionaries to use to do translation tasks? I guess it really depends on the language in question. Nothing specific is coming to mind. But yeah, certainly I remember one that we used or that we looked at when we did Kirundi, that was made by some students at a university in Burundi, and that was really interesting, and that was, I believe, voiced as well. So yeah, you never know what you might find when you search for different apps. We always work with language communities. That's something that's really important to us. So yeah, we can always draw on their knowledge and expertise when it comes to that as well. So Miguel, if you have a specific language in mind, please ask me and I might be able to send some contacts your way. Okay, then Miguel also asks, how does one go about creating a new word for something that cannot be translated so easily? That is a great question. Yeah, oftentimes descriptive language is used. So we looked at the example in Hawaiian for kettle, where we ended up translating it as something like cup for boiling water. So using something that's logical, usually something that's going to be slightly longer, maybe a bit more wordy. That's one solution. So the person who we work with for Hawaiian is important in the Hawaiian community. So he didn't just make this up off the top of his head. He consulted various different people and got the approval to do that before we implemented that. And I think that's also important to, as a mark of respect. Another solution for some modern words, I guess things like Wi-Fi, often just the English has been adopted among a great many languages. So some people just choose to kind of use some kind of transliteration or like adapt it slightly so that it sounds like it was written in their language. I'm trying to think of an example now. Maybe someone can help me out. I know there are examples. I'll see if I can think of any and let you know later on. Great question. Next question. How good is machine translation by now compared to human translators? Great question. It's definitely getting better. It is not great for languages that are less widely spoken. To give you one example, Google Translate, the most obvious example, I believe there's around about 140 something languages now that are on there. So there are some kind of lesser known languages on there, which is, I will admit that it is impressive. But inevitably, the output from 4 languages that are less widely spoken, the quality is not going to be as good, simply because the number of words or the corpus that the machine uses to produce that translation in whatever language, it's just not as big. There aren't as many websites in those languages, and that's why. But I don't know how else to answer that. It is improving, but I think it will never be the same as human translators because the nuance gets missed. But for some purposes, sometimes machine translation is fine if you just want to get a gist of the text, for example. So for legal documents, actually it can work pretty well. Just to give you one example, if you just want to get an overview. Okay, Chuck asked a question. Is the translation technique of using 2 independent translators common, or is it unique to uTalk's process? I'm wondering how commonly used this process is. Great question, thank you, Chuck. I have never come across this technique before. I think it's unique, but it might not be. I think that because it's more costly and it takes more time, certainly a lot of translation agencies wouldn't go for this approach because they prefer to do things on the cheap and as fast as possible, which I don't always think is the best way because you can really compromise on quality because of that. But quality is something that's really important to us, so we're willing to go the extra mile to get the best end result. And we've been doing that for quite a few years now. So yeah, it's a tried and tested technique that's worked well for us, at least. Okay, whoa, so many questions. Next one. Where the speaking is different from the writing, how do you decide this for uTalk? I often see the discrepancy on, like, Netflix. What are your thoughts? Where the speaking is different from the writing. Do you mean that there are different ways to say the same word, I wonder? Or, yeah, I might need a bit of clarification on that. I'll try and answer it in the way that I think you mean. Although I'm trying to think of an example of a common language that would be impacted by that. Certainly the example that I gave for Cornish, there are multiple ways to spell the same words. So, yeah, I don't think you'll be watching much Netflix in Cornish. But yeah, this we went for the most standard form of writing. So we picked a specific dialect, but it was a tough choice, and inevitably not everyone is going to be happy with that. But you have to make a decision. You have to make a call at some point. Yeah, I hope that more or less answers the question. Okay, next one. I was surprised when you mentioned that you used Navarrese translators to work in Standard Basque. Ooh, okay. Maybe this is a Basque speaker, I'm not sure. Is it? Ah, okay. Do you know what? Okay, also a great question. I personally didn't work on this one. This is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but maybe we can talk later and I can show you the app and you can give me some feedback. And yeah, if you think it's horrible, then maybe we can work together and do something about that. Okay, next question. Imagine we end up stuck at some moment during our work, but we have no one around we could ask a question, ask for help, advice. Could you suggest any solution? Yes, there are some forums out there that you can use. One that I've used a fair bit is the Word Reference Forum, but I'm sure there are plenty of other forums out there as well. Yeah, this is the one that I would recommend, wordreference.com. If it's perhaps a rarer language that might not be represented on a forum like that, I also know that there is a community page on iTalki. People ask each other all kinds of questions. It perhaps it's not necessarily so kind of like career focused, but it could still be useful, and you could definitely connect with speakers on that. And I think many people are very active in that community, so you could get answers quite quickly on there. Or come to an event like this and meet other people, and you can ask us here. Okay, next question. Can you remind the tool which you've mentioned while saying that the average numbers of words a translator translates per day are 2,000? That is a good question. So this is just kind of a standard that I went by when I worked at the translation agency that I mentioned. I actually worked at 2 different translation agencies, and this is kind of like an industry accepted level. Although this was translating from English, it might be a bit different if you're translating from another language, perhaps, where there are more characters, the words are longer. But yeah, that's kind of an average industry standard, I think, that's quite widely accepted across the board. Okay, so we've got one more question that I think we have time for. And it is, are all your translations done in Trados Studio? Does it support all the languages you're translating? Another great question. I know I mentioned Trados a fair bit. Actually, at uTalk, we do not use Trados. We programmed our own translation tool. And that's what we use. Trados does support a great many languages. I can't remember how many, but I can't imagine that it supports all of the ones that we have. In fact, I'm going to go away and check that out and see. But yeah, Trados is a really great tool. And I do recommend using a translation tool, a CAT tool, if you are considering becoming a professional translator, because it will save you a lot of time and hassle. And it's very user-friendly. So yeah, the one that we use is similar in style, but we have programmed it in-house. All right, any more questions? Looks like that's pretty much it. So yeah, thank you so much for coming to the talk, and we'd love to chat with you later on, and we'd be delighted if you were interested in checking out our app for free. Thank you.